You're listening to Raincoast Radio. Welcome to Raincoast Radio's first series of Wolves and Women. I'm Sophia Osborne, the producer of Raincoast Radio. Today, I'm excited to interview Chelsea Greer, the host of this series and the director of Raincoast's Wolf Conservation Program, about her own journey as a woman who studies wolves. Thanks for joining me as the interviewee today, Chelsea.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on the other side of things.
Could you start by introducing yourself for our listeners?
I should have been anticipating this question. I'm Chelsea Greer, and I work with the Raincoast Conservation Foundation as our director of our wolf conservation program. Started working with Raincoast while I was doing my graduate work as an intern, and it led me to the position I'm in now. And so I've been working with Raincoast full-time now for about 4 years. And yeah, it's been an amazing journey, and I'm excited to talk a little bit more about it today.
Great. So how did you first become interested in studying wildlife?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have always really, really loved animals. I didn't necessarily grow up around a lot of animals, but I'd say like whenever I had the chance to visit my aunt's farm or say hi to someone's dog or collecting snails is a really prominent memory of mine when I was young. And my mom loved it. I would collect them all from my mom's garden. I was just always really captivated, I guess, by animals when I got the chance to be around them and really curious. And I didn't necessarily think, oh, this is what I want to do as my career. I didn't really have an idea of what that could look like. I watched a lot of documentaries about zoos when I was younger and really admired that like really close relationship and personal relationship that those zookeepers would have with their animals, and how they appeared to really like know their personalities and understand them really well. So that really captivated me and kind of essentially led me to my undergrad degree, where it wasn't really until I started learning there about animal welfare that I quickly realized that there was much better ways to care for and help wild animals, and captivity wasn't necessarily a great life for most animals. So yeah, that's kind of where it all led me, just a really big curiosity with animals and the animals that I was able to be in contact with.
Yeah, could you talk a bit more about your experience in undergrad majoring in applied animal biology and how that's shaped where you are today?
Yeah, so my bachelor's degree was not only focused on animal physiology and behavior, but also around the role of and ethics around animals in human society. A lot of what we learned focused on welfare around captive animals, like those in zoos or farms. But I always had a really keen interest in wildlife, and there were some amazing courses taught by Dr. Kristen Walker. Her work focused a lot on wildlife. Her courses focused a lot on wildlife welfare. So she was a real inspiration and mentor for me during those times to kind of, I think it's easy when you just really generally love animals in general. I think the program was focused a lot around farm animals, and UBC has a dairy farm, and so a lot of folks would work on welfare around dairy cattle. And I think if I had gone down that route and had experiences with projects that focused on dairy cattle, I probably would have fallen in love with them and maybe taken a different route. But, talking to this professor, Dr. Walker, I think just really her recommending to kind of follow where my passions were and follow down the route of wildlife welfare was a big part of where I ended up. And then also in this program, we learned a lot about kind of alternative paradigms to traditional conservation and animal welfare science. So my interests began to kind of center around the notions of coexistence and how animal welfare principles apply to wildlife. So shortly after graduating, I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to kind of explore those interests more hands-on and help run a pilot study for the behavior of semi-wild Asian elephants in Thailand. And then this work ultimately led me to pursue my master's degree in geography, where I studied the same family of elephants, while also fostering a curiosity for wolves and coyotes and conservation science as well. But just to say, like, I guess this is kind of probably a little bit of advice to people trying to figure out what they want to do. But I took a while to decide what I wanted to do. And you kind of look back at all those choices and, you can be harder on yourself being like, I took so long to finish this and that, but all of it kind of led to where I am today. So a lot of those opportunities wouldn't have been present if I, had finished my undergrad degree in like 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. Well, I would love to hear more about what it was like doing, I guess, your undergraduate and then graduate research on Asian elephants and what that experience was like, what you were studying. I've heard you in our interviews sort of hint at the work, and it sounds really interesting. So I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, so one of the main goals of this research was to better understand the behavioral and ecological needs of elephants that were rescued from captive settings and then transitioned into a rewilded life. So just a bit of background in Thailand, the laws are interesting that they currently kind of put elephants into two distinct categories and two distinct populations. So you have wild Asian elephants who are a protected species, whereas captive Asian elephants are registered as essentially livestock, allowing their owners to use and trade them at will. And these are the exact same species, just their particular life situation allows them different protections or non-protections. And in Thailand, there's over 3,700 captive elephants, and the majority of them live in really poor welfare conditions in what we would call elephant camps that were established for tourism. And so a lot of those camps are profit driven. They're very exploitative in nature, and which often perpetuates physically dangerous conditions for not only the elephants, but also the mahouts, who are the elephant keepers or caretakers. And so with this project, we were partnering with a non-government organization called the Mahouts Elephant Foundation, where they collaborate with Karen Indigenous mahouts and their communities to kind of create these alternative models for elephant protection and tourism to successfully reintroduce captive elephants into community managed forests. Because without sustainable sources of income, many people in these communities either they feel compelled to sell their elephants, or they have to essentially leave their families and go to the cities to bring their elephants into these tourist camps. So kind of by collaborating with these communities that own the elephants, it's kind of an alternative model that both supports conservation and then can also create kind of a cultural and economic stability for these communities, while also importantly allowing these animals. They might still be designated as captive and owned by people, but it provides like a way for the elephants to live in an environment where they can forage for natural plants and form social groups and bonds. So essentially my work was to look at the behavior of these elephants.
For listeners, like, how do you study elephant behavior, and what did kind of a typical day doing that research look like?
Yeah, so a typical day. Well, first of all, so it was really preliminary in nature. So we were typically studying behavior, you would have an ethogram developed, which would essentially be a table with names for each behavior and a description of each behavior. And you kind of note down when those behaviors would occur. For this, we really wanted to get a lot of the nuance and detail of what was going on. So it took a little while to get used to, but essentially when we were in front of the elephants, I would choose a focal elephant to focus on. And I would talk into my phone for like 30 to 45 minutes straight, just like constantly describing what was happening, what the elephants were doing, what was happening around them, any interactions between the elephants or the elephants with their mahouts. And so, yeah, essentially a day in the life would look like waking up, having breakfast, getting together with the crew and the mahouts and hiking into the forest where we would track and find the elephants. And then we would kind of have a random system of like which elephant to focus on. And yeah, the day would essentially consist of us following them around, maintaining a respectful distance, but they were also, keep in mind, they are more tame elephants, so they're really used to being around humans. But it was really important to have the mahouts there just for safety purposes. And even though they're used to humans being around them, they have a much different relationship with the mahouts than they might have with like a random researcher. And they all had very distinct personalities. And I'd say some were more tolerable of humans than others. So just like keeping that in mind. So yeah, we'd follow them around, record exactly what we saw and what they were doing. There's also people kind of recording like what they were foraging on as well to kind of get an idea of the diversity of their diet. And then we'd break for lunch. And if we were lucky, we would get to have a nap in the middle of the forest, which was always nice. And then, yes, continue on studying the elephants and then hike out of the forest the next day and kind of do that every few days with a few breaks. But the mahouts would be out there 7 days a week, every single day of the year. So yeah, and we got to do a couple of night observations too, which was really interesting because it hasn't been very well studied, like what elephants are really doing at night. And I mean, that ended up not being as feasible just with, the mahouts having to work 7 days a week, every day. Asking them to be around while we were doing night observations wasn't necessarily realistic. But yeah, it was really interesting to just sit in the forest. We'd rotate. I don't think I ever ended up being alone, but other people were alone. You'd just kind of sit in the dark with night vision goggles and watch the elephants and record what you saw. And sometimes like one of the calves was, so these elephants, there's different management strategies for, how different communities might approach having their elephants live in communities. And one traditional way is to have drag chains on the elephants. And this kind of limits their movements and allows you to be able to track them as well, because it'll create kind of like a drag chain, a line that you can track through the forest. And the perceptions of the drag chains are, you could imagine some people don't like seeing those, but when you put it into context of the alternative would essentially be, because these elephants are being reintroduced into areas around communities that have agriculture around crops that they want to protect, you really want to minimize the human-elephant conflict that is so pervasive in these areas. So the alternative would be to bring them back to a location and pen them somewhere, which having like a larger radius where they can naturally forage throughout the evening, I think is much more beneficial than being kind of locked up in a pen. But there was one young calf within this family, and so he wasn't tethered. So we had some interesting kind of encounters at night where you're trying to record what's going on and speak into the phone, and they have really good hearing. So I think we attracted him a couple times, and the mahouts had to intervene. But yeah, it's very exciting.
Yeah. Are there any other like memories or stories that stand out to you from that time?
Yeah, I think there were several of this nature, but one that really sticks with me is kind of the mother elephant letting out a low rumble, which is kind of this like low frequency vocalization that they use for long distance communication. And in this case, it would have been very short distance communication, but one of the mahouts, who was a highly respected elder within the community, and he'd been caring for elephants for, I think, over 50 years. The elephant let out this low rumble, and then he said to us, she's telling the others to follow her. And then sure enough, she turned around, started walking up a pathway in the forest, and then all 3 elephants formed a line behind her and started following her. And I just thought that was a really interesting and amazing display of not only human communication, but also like the really special bond and understanding that these elephant caretakers have with and of these animals. Yeah, so I thought it was a great way to kind of, show the positive side of the human-elephant relationship.
Yeah. I'm curious what were like the findings that came out of that research? I know you said it was quite preliminary.
There's not as much, it can be difficult to study elephants in the wild. You have African elephants and Asian elephants, but Asian elephants live in much forested, more densely forested habitat. And of course, you don't want to get too close to wild elephants. So it kind of gave us the opportunity to really look at their foraging behaviors more closely and kind of create like a behavioral repertoire of how they spend their day in more detail. And I think one interesting thing was just like capturing the overlap and complexity of behaviors within foraging. It's like often you'll see in an activity budget for elephants that they spend, like 50 to 70% foraging or feeding. And yes, that's kind of what we saw, but within that time, we also saw so many other behaviors happen. They could be foraging with another elephant and touching trunks and taking breaks to play, or like mud bathing and playing at the same time. Like mud bathing is something to kind of, for elephants, like their skin can be really sensitive and they live in a hot climate. So often they'll coat their skin with mud and dirt for protection. But also, like, you see these variations in age playing in the mud, and you can kind of see the use for it, but then it's also a way that they're, playing and bonding with one another. So I think that was a really interesting finding that came out of it, is just like the complexity of behaviors that these animals have.
So how did you become involved with wolf conservation and with Raincoast, sort of transitioning from elephants to wolves?
So working with the elephant team, doing the preliminary work, it was always kind of an option that this could be turned into like a master's project. And me wanting to stay in Canada, and kind of my supervisor of that project being in the US, we kind of explored different options with other professors that had similar values aligned with them and would be interested in kind of taking on a student working on the elephant work. So that kind of led me to go to the University of Calgary, where I was part of the Canid Conservation Science Lab. And one of the women that we interviewed was Shelley Alexander. So she was my co-supervisor in that project. And as we've learned from that interview, Shelley has studied wolves and coyotes, or coyotes, as she would say. And so that really gave me an introduction to her work, and then friends that I made within the lab that were focusing on that kind of work. I learned a lot about not only just the ecology of these carnivores, but also the level of persecution that canid species like wolves and coyotes face in today's world and have faced for a long time. And I found that really interesting. And also like a big thing too, it's so interesting. Like, I mean, elephants are absolutely incredible animals, but we don't have elephants here. And I think that I really had a strong desire to nourish my connection to kind of the land and wildlife that live in an area that I live in. So I had an opportunity to kind of explore internship opportunities while I was doing my graduate work, and I found funding for myself. And then once I had kind of learned more about Raincoast and their values in both kind of the conservation and animal welfare worlds, I knew I really wanted to be part of their team. And I don't think I explored any other option. And I emailed, I think, 4 different people like 8 times until I got a response. And I think it was really good timing as well. But I think the persistence and trying to figure out who the best person to like get through to was, I ended up, just being able to get through. And given like my connection to the Canid Conservation Science Lab and kind of what was going on in the wolf world at the time, I think at that time, this wolf named Stakaya, who lived on Vancouver Island, was getting a lot of media attention because he had just, I think at that time, had just been shot and killed by a hunter. So there was kind of this momentum to really start developing a wolf conservation program within Raincoast. Raincoast has worked on kind of wolves since the beginning, but there had never really been an established program. So the internship role that I took on kind of worked with the other team members within the wolf program to kind of develop that program and get it off the ground.
Is that when you met Paul Paquette?
Yeah. Sally has a long history with Paul as well. And I remember her saying like, oh yeah, Paul's going to give you a call, because he hadn't met me yet. And it's so funny, like this generation, like I was like, oh, like, okay, when is he going to call me? Like I have to prepare for this call. Like you don't normally just randomly call people these days. And just to, I guess is a little bit of a segue, but what I really cherish about like me and Paul's relationship, I think he's like one of the 2 people that I will talk to on the phone for hours. So I was awaiting his call, and we eventually got to connect, and he's, been a huge part of the start of Raincoast and the visioning for Raincoast, and is currently a senior scientist at Raincoast and our large carnivore expert. And so he's been a mentor to, I think, so many of us, and continues to be a mentor, but also is a huge advisor on a lot of our work in terms of his expertise.
Yeah, and just if people have listened to the previous episodes, like it seems like Paul has pretty much influenced like every woman wolf researcher out there. Yeah, it just sounds like such a strong and supportive mentor to have.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it might have been Chris Darramont that said something around these lines of he just really like makes you believe that you can do anything. There's no like shutting down and saying like, no, I don't think that's a good idea. It's just the way that he mentors is very much, yeah, makes you believe in that you can do anything, which is, I think, a great quality to have in a mentor.
Absolutely. And so, could you tell us more about Raincoast's wolf conservation program?
Yeah, so the focus of the program is essentially to support the protection and conservation of wolves in British Columbia. And we do this mainly through peer-reviewed scientific research, public education, community engagement, and wildlife management reform. So a lot of this, the wolf program clearly focuses on wolves, but it also, we have a lot of conversations around other carnivores as well. And I think in general, we've historically focused a lot on bears as well, but kind of as an overarching goal of kind of protecting the life requisites of these animals and their welfare via coexistence and the promotion of a wildlife welfare ethic that includes non-invasive monitoring, but it also is guided by this kind of inherent link between science and ethics. So our approach, I think this comes a lot out of the wolf program, but our approach in all programs is to conservation and wildlife management reform is to kind of continue to be grounded in doing the most good and the least amount of harm to people, animals, and the environment. So that kind of shapes a lot of the projects and initiatives that we work on. And in the wolf program specifically, we kind of have this work stream of focusing on scientific research, where we partner with local First Nations and alongside those Indigenous partners. Specifically for the wolf program right now, we're documenting the return and recovery of wolves in about 4 neighboring watersheds, not too far from the city centers of Metro Vancouver. And what's really interesting about this region is that nearly 2 decades ago, and I think it dates back even farther than that, but Roosevelt elk started to be reintroduced into 2 of these watersheds. And both of those populations are doing exceptionally well and even expanding to nearby watersheds. And so following their expansion, we've seen the return of wolves to these areas that, they once were and were likely extirpated from during the times of, in BC, especially between like the 50s and 70s and earlier than that as well. Wolves were really highly persecuted and there's a lot of bounties and bounty programs to kind of extirpate them from some regions. But yeah, so seeing the return of these wolves to these areas, it's really exciting, not only given their ecological importance, but also their cultural importance to a lot of these communities that we're working with. And I think as a big part of that research, we always have the curiosity of learning more about the wolves that we're studying and large carnivore ecology more broadly. But one thing that I love about these projects is just the time that we take to deepen our relationships with community partners, and then also being able to apply this knowledge to support more like evidence-based holistic management practices that can hopefully foster positive outcomes for wildlife. And then another kind of work stream of the program is this kind of wolf campaign, I guess, to inspire public policy change. Just as a little bit of background, under traditional wildlife management, wolves are often seen as a number and individuals don't matter. But in BC, hundreds of wolves are being killed at the hands of lethal control programs, whether it's for caribou recovery or livestock protection. And then additionally, the BC government estimates that over 900 wolves are killed annually from recreational hunting alone. So that doesn't include being trapped commercially for profit or recreationally for sport. So what's interesting, and this isn't just in BC and not even really just in North America, but globally, I'd say the fate of large carnivores continues to be kind of more closely tied to sociology than biology. It's really a public policy issue. So we're kind of have been kind of like slowly chipping away at developing a wolf campaign that kind of can hopefully serve as a powerful means to promote social change and also policy change concerning the lethal management of wolves and kind of hopefully reimagining, what Paul always likes to say, management for wildlife versus management of wildlife. Because if you look at the wolf management plan, it's very heavily focused on lethal management strategies that involve killing wolves and not necessarily protecting habitat for them. And I think an important thing to think about too is when you protect habitat for wolves, because they are such a large ranging carnivore and have such a profound ecological impact. And this is what we call an umbrella species too. You're really protecting habitat for so many other species.
Yeah, could you talk a bit more about why wolf conservation is important? I think in a lot of our interviews, we've talked about seeing wolves as individuals and everything, but also how do they factor into ecosystems?
Yeah, so studying wolves is a really great entry point into understanding the broader ecosystem because, once they're established within an ecosystem, they really have a profound effect. And this relates to a lot of different things, but even just, they're often primary prey species could include, elk, deer, moose, and their very presence can influence the behavior of those animals through a variety of things. But one thing would be, even just direct consumption of those animals. And this can actually have a great impact in a fully functioning ecosystem, can have a good impact on keeping those prey populations healthy, as typically they'll go for, the young, the sick, the old, the weak, and kind of pick out those individuals that aren't as physically strong. And so that can kind of leave those stronger animals to reproduce, creating a healthier prey population. And then they also have kind of these non-consumptive effects on those prey species as well. So without wolves on the landscape, ungulates like deer and elk, they don't necessarily have a reason to be as vigilant. So they can end up overgrazing in a lot of areas of their habitat, including riparian areas that need shade and tree species for aquatic health as well. So having wolves on the landscape and creating kind of that landscape of fear for these animals can kind of change the movements of these animals. And that can have positive impacts for those prey species as well. So they're not overgrazing the very habitat that they rely on. And all of this kind of trickles down and has impacts on other species, like nesting space for birds. Aquatic habitat, requires really good shade for trees. So it kind of has all these kind of cascading impacts on that ecosystem. And then beyond ecological reasons, I think wolves and wolf conservation is really important because wolves, hold cultural value to many communities. They also hold intrinsic value. And I think conservation of wolves often serves as a larger indicator of our commitment to protecting the environment as a whole.
Yeah, so what do you do as director of the wolf conservation program? Do you get to get out into the field a lot?
Yeah, currently as director, I do a little bit of everything. My favorite thing to do is get out in the field for sure. And I think as the program, my absolute vision and hope for the program is to grow. And sometimes that means giving up some field work, but it's such a positive thing as well to get to see other raincoasters take over those roles. But yeah, over the past couple of years, a major focus has been on building relationships and developing these research programs, mainly focused in the Lower Mainland. And one of the things that I love about our approach at Raincoast, and this is across all programs, not just the Wolf program, is that we get to truly take our time to deepen our work rather than just scratching the surface on a lot of different things. So a lot of my time over the last few years has really been establishing these programs and deepening those important relationships that require the longevity of these projects and for these projects to have a larger impact. So I'm really, really excited about the direction of the research side of things and the relationships we've built along the way. But yeah, it's we all work remotely, so it's kind of a lot of working from the desk, doing important work, and then sprinkled in throughout that is the field work as well.
And you talked a bit about how Raincoast prioritizes animal ethics and welfare. Could you talk a bit more about what that looks like specifically with wolf research?
Yeah. I think animal ethics and welfare are deeply intertwined with wolf conservation because both concern the humane treatment, protection, and respect for the intrinsic value of animals. And at Raincoast, I talked a little bit about this kind of wildlife welfare ethic that we try to abide by. And this ethic acknowledges that the suffering of wildlife due to human activity is really our collective responsibility and kind of presents a moral imperative for conservationists and animal welfareists to carefully consider and act upon. And I think when we think about conservation and animal welfare and the impact that human activity has on these animals, we have habitat destruction, trophy hunting, overexploitation of food resources. All of that can cause suffering of individuals in the wild through displacement, stress, starvation, reduced security. So one of the things that emerged from Raincoast Wolf Project, but is definitely present within all our programs, is kind of the awareness that the integrity and welfare of animal habitat and their populations is really closely linked to the welfare of individual animals. And we also, as I mentioned, this welfare ethic also includes kind of non-invasive monitoring as well. So we try our best to kind of advance, probably should say minimally invasive, because I think even the less invasive techniques still have a little bit of an impact on animals, especially when we're talking about wolves. They're highly sensitive species that are aware of like any small change in their environment. But yeah, so part of the research side of things is we try and apply those minimally invasive techniques and advance them in any way that we can as well. But I think it's important to, I think historically, just as the fields have formed and progressed, there are varying worldviews within conservationists and animal welfareists. But I think at Raincoast, we really try to work from the premise that these two worldviews are very closely related.
Yeah, and so I guess to back up a bit, could you tell us about the first time you saw a wolf in the wild?
So we were going into the watershed for about 4 days, checking all the cameras that we had deployed. It was May, so springtime, and we were in kind of this tributary that's really important salmon habitat, but of course salmon weren't running at that time. But we have 3 cameras in that stream because there's a lot of wildlife activity there. So we were wading down the stream, and we were with my colleague Valeria, and then also some of the salmon people that were working on, I think they were doing trapping at the time. And so there was one person from the community, as well as a salmon biologist. And yeah, we were all kind of standing around in the water, checking the camera off the riparian area. And I was facing, I don't know what direction, but away from what was about to happen. And Valeria all of a sudden says like, "Oh, you guys, like, turn around, look." And so we all kind of turn around, and this black wolf had jumped out of the forest, either like, I don't know, coming to check us out and maybe had heard us, but the water is also really loud. So I don't know if he or she was kind of going to travel across the stream and then all of a sudden saw us, but kind of stopped in their tracks and looked at us long enough that we all kind of got a good look at the wolf. And then the wolf ran back into the forest, and we were all really quiet, and we could start to hear the wolf vocalizing. And it was a bark howl, which is a very unique vocalization in terms of, or very specific to a certain context. Wolves will bark or bark howl as kind of a warning to other wolves that there might be a threat in the area, and also a way to communicate to that potential threat that like, hey, you need to leave. And so we recorded that for about 3 minutes, and then knowing kind of the message that they were trying to send us, we quickly gathered our stuff and moved out of the area. And so that vocalization is very specific to home site areas. And a home site area can include like a den site where pups are being raised, or also a rendezvous site, which is more of a like open grassy area that pups will be raised after they move out of a den. And so that vocalization is pretty specific to that time of year and that location. And given that it was May, and this wolf population typically gives birth around like mid-April, the pups would probably be like 4+ weeks old. So it told us that there was a den site nearby. And then that was kind of confirmed through the cameras as well. We got to see a lot of detections of the breeding female after she had given birth. So you could see like her lactating teats and just a lot of activity of her in that area, because typically she won't move too far out of the area when she's still nursing the pups. Yeah, and what came out of that interaction I thought was really cool as well, like working really closely with the community, and they have done some amazing work to restore salmon habitat in the area, and they had some big restoration plans for that specific area. And after we kind of told them about there being a den site there and providing some recommendations around like a buffer zone and kind of some mitigations to avoid disturbance, because it's a much more sensitive time for wolves around that time. Like if they feel compelled to move too early, that can always put the pups in danger, especially if it requires crossing fast moving water and things like that. And it was really cool to see them kind of shift these big plans around and, start a project in a different area sooner and kind of defer the plans for this one to give them like an extra few months of minimal disturbance. So it was a really cool way to have like this amazing experience with a wolf, and then also see like the implications of us being on the landscape and experiencing that. And then more personally, during that encounter, like I had recently experienced a pretty big loss in my life. And it was like I truly saw that wolf as like a sign from that person that everything was going to be okay. It was like having that kind of encounter with a wolf definitely sticks with you. And yeah, it's something that I'll always remember during that like kind of harder time in my life.
Yeah, I was going to ask also how it felt. I'm always curious talking to, scientists who devote their lives to helping these wild animals that they might not get to see almost ever. And like, how did it feel like after having done so much work and like devoting your work to helping them? Like, I'm just curious what that experience was like to actually see the wolf and hear those vocalizations and everything.
Yeah. Yeah, it was just really cool too, because often, I mean, when you see wolves, it's a pretty quick encounter. And I think, like, as you said, a lot of, like devoting your life to studying an animal that you might never really see. I mean, for wolves, and a lot of animals, it's almost a good sign, like that they are steering clear from humans. So I think we always go into the field being like, oh, I hope we like see wildlife and encounter wildlife. But then when we don't, it's also like, okay, that's good. Like, I mean, we've done salmon stream walks where we're calling out hay bears or trying to alert the bears the whole way. And you see like really fresh sign of salmon carcasses and all of that. But you're like, it really tells you that these bears, they don't want to encounter you either. So, and that's always good that they kind of maintain that wariness of humans. But yeah, when you get the chance to see one, it's definitely really, really special, especially when it's like a more prolonged encounter and when there's so much information. I think that you can get from that encounter. Like that one had so many layers to it because of like the time of year and the vocalization, and just like knowing that from being told by Paul and reading the literature of like what that vocalization means. It's like, it seems extra special when you experience it in person. And then you're like, can tell people like, hey, we got to leave. We have to get out of here if we want to respect what this animal is trying to tell us.
Yeah. So I guess switching to talk about this podcast, what inspired you to create the Of Women and Wolves series?
I don't want to take full credit for this idea. It was something that Paul and I have been talking about for a while now. And it was an idea that he brought to me. And you'll hear in all of these interviews that Paul is a very common thread among a lot or all of these women. And I think that speaks to just, I mean, we're talking to women that started studying wolves in the 70s. And he was someone that really looked past any like gender biases at the time and really valued and still values people, I think, for their curiosity and determination and drive. And is someone also that really gives credit where credit is due. And so with this series of Wolves and Women, we really wanted to create something that celebrated women scientists and their contributions, which for many were novel and unique given the era, and really showcase why they were important. And as you'll experience, these women have some really amazing stories to tell, whether it's about the wolves that they studied or the people that they encountered along the way. They're all really, truly inspiring. And I think that's one of the things that we aim to do with the series is to inspire our listeners to care about wolves and wolf conservation.
Yeah. And what have you learned from conducting these interviews with these women?
I feel like I've learned a lot of different things. They all have really unique perspectives and contributions. But yeah, from interviewing these women, I think I learned the immense power of resilience, the importance of self belief, and the impact of vulnerability and strength. And yeah, each of these women has a unique story to tell, yet there's like a lot of common threads of curiosity, determination, passion, and courage. Those all kind of weave throughout all of them. And I think learning really to like be, and I'm fairly new in my career as well, so a lot of this applies to me. I think like being really open to where your career might take you and maybe in the direction that you didn't expect. And I think really taking the risk, especially when it's in a direction that will really add meaning to your life and you're curious and passionate about that. And then, of course, their stories also deepened my understanding of wolves and kind of highlighted the importance of sharing untold narratives, whether it's about individual wolves and their journeys or like the natural process of colonization before reintroduction, or the need to listen to those perspectives that may differ from our own, kind of thinking about the human dimensions of things. And I think we don't necessarily need to agree with everyone, but I think there's an avenue for building trust when we listen before we speak. Yeah, and I think generally, yeah, they've just deepened my understanding of what it means to be working hard because you're passionate and curious about something. And yeah, just the importance of, I think a lot of people that go into working with animals and wildlife, I think this is kind of how I viewed it at the beginning is like, oh, I much prefer animals than people. I'd love to just be around animals more. But I mean, one thing I've definitely learned going into this world and working with Raincoast is like the people are so, so important, and like building relationships with those people that you share values with and goals with, but also like putting the time to try and forge relationships with those that you don't necessarily agree with and like bridging the gap. Because I mean, wolves and wolf conservation can be like a very contentious topic, and there's often it's humans against humans. And I think, yeah, really trying to bridge that. And I think that was a big thing that I learned from a lot of them. A lot of these women is just how to listen to people.
Yeah, totally. I think there have been a lot of lessons from the interviews that are not just applicable to researchers and scientists, but really anyone. I think there's a lot to learn from both wolves and the people who study them as well. One question that you've asked everyone that has been a big hit and I feel like really made people think is what has working with wolves taught you about yourself? So I wanted to ask you that as well.
You know, I had to think a lot about this because it stumped a few people because it's such a deep question in some ways. The first thing that came to mind was that wolves have taught me so far a lot about patience, humility, and as I kind of talked about in the previous question, the importance of listening, not just to the animals, but also to my own instincts as well. And then also the people that I've had the privilege to work alongside. I think, yeah, the importance of not only listening in a lot of those cases, but then also sharing knowledge with others as well. Wolves kind of have a way of challenging your assumptions and kind of forcing you to slow down and to truly understand their behavior and needs. And I think that's made me more aware of the balance between control and trust and how powerful it can be to work with rather than against nature and people, other people. Yeah, and then in many ways, it's also reminded me of the value of connection and, yeah, how crucial it is to build trust and understanding. Again, not only with wolves, but also with people.
And do you have any advice? I mean, I think this has all been great advice, but from your own experience, do you have advice for girls and young women who are interested in working in wildlife conservation?
Yeah, I would say don't be afraid to challenge the conventional and stand up for what you believe in. I think the world needs and will benefit from unique perspectives and courage. And yeah, I think staying true to who you are and not letting fear hold you back from following your passion. I think a lot of the times, I mean, we've talked a lot about like imposter syndrome, like especially when you go through grad school, like I think it's pretty prevalent. And even in my career today, working with some amazing scientists, but I think, yeah, not letting yourself hold you back and standing firm in your values. And then I guess I would also, just for more tangible advice in terms of like what I would say to get your foot in the door is, especially when you're really young, like looking at those opportunities to volunteer, looking into internships. I think getting as much experience doing different things within whatever field you're interested in is really important, just because, I mean, I think about this with some of the projects that we work on and engagement with community members and trying to get them, like provide as much opportunity to get young people out in the field with us so that they can dabble a little bit in like what it means to like study wolves with cameras and acoustic recorders and collecting genetic samples, or what it's like to count fish in a stream. And you may absolutely love it and be like, I didn't know a job like this was something that was an option. Or you might be like, oh, I absolutely hate this. And it's just a great way to learn and find out what you love or hate. I think the only way to do that is by doing it. And just, I think, can't remember which interview this was, what we talked a lot about is just like really being curious and staying curious.
Yeah, great. Well, how can listeners help support Raincoast and the Wolf Conservation Program?
Yeah, there's a few different meaningful ways listeners can support. I'd say first, spreading the word, not only kind of sharing our mission and stories with friends and family to help raise awareness, but perhaps more importantly, spreading the good word about wolves and helping dispel some myths and misinformation that have surrounded them for centuries. I mean, they're often misunderstood and unfairly vilified, and there's a lot of negative perceptions that come from like these outdated beliefs and sensationalized portrayals in the media. So, I mean, just by sharing accurate information, you can kind of help reshape that narrative and foster a more compassionate and realistic understanding of these incredible animals. And then second, I would say consider donating or contributing if you're able to. Every bit of support goes directly to furthering our efforts, whether it's supporting content like this on podcasts or supporting our scientific research. And then lastly, I'd say just staying informed and engaged. Every action, big or small, makes a big difference.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Chelsea. It was great to hear more about you and your work. So thanks so much for sitting in the hot seat.
Yeah, thank you, Sophia.
I want to acknowledge that this episode was hosted and recorded on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands.
This series is dedicated to Gudrun Pfluger, a passionate field biologist, friend, and source of inspiration to many within Raincoast and beyond. Raincoast Radio is hosted by Chelsea Greer and produced by me, Sophia Osborne, with additional audio editing by Omar Salafu. This podcast is a production of Raincoast Conservation Foundation, a team of conservationists and scientists empowered by research to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia. Learn more and support our work at raincoast.org.